Shavuot Tov, Rabotai. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Zayin Mishnah Daled. We learned previously regarding when you harvest, when you pick off the cluster of grapes from the vineyard, there's a mitzvah known as peret, the individual grapes, the one or two individual grapes that fall on the ground, you have to leave over for the poor. You cannot collect them. The Mishnah introduces to us another mitzvah of leaving item over for the poor regarding these clusters. It's called olelot. The Torah says, you are not allowed to pick the underdeveloped clusters from the vineyard. You must leave it for the poor and for the convert to collect. And the term olelot derives from the word olel, a child, because when you compare these underdeveloped clusters to normal, fully developed clusters, it's like comparing a child to an adult. Therefore, we call it olel, from the language of a child. The Mishnah now is going to tell us what makes a cluster underdeveloped. What is the characteristic that it's required? So now, just to know, a fully developed cluster of grapes, we have a central stem going down. It has small bunches of grapes growing from the top, and then numerous individual grapes growing from the bottom. Olelot are clusters that don't have this type of characteristic, this formation. Ezeu olelot. What type of grape cluster is an olelet that you have to leave for the poor? Ezeu olelet. Kol she'ena lo katef velo natef. It has no shoulder and it has no dripping. Now, what does it mean, no shoulder? The Rav explains that at the top of a cluster, you have small branches that extend from the stem, each with a small bunch of grapes. So when the cluster is thick with these bunches that have individual small bunches, it's called shoulders because the bunches rest on each other like a package rests on the shoulder of a person. So we call those shoulders. When you have the small bunches, these small branches that extend from the stem, and on them you have small bunches of grapes. So they're resting on each other like a package on a shoulder of a person. That's called katef. Natef literally means dripping, because at the bottom of a cluster you have grapes that don't grow on small branches but directly on the stem. When the cluster is thick with these grapes, they look like they're dripping down from the end of the cluster, from down the cluster. They're called dripping. So the Mishnah says, what's considered olelet, a cluster that's underdeveloped, the athlete for the poor? It has neither the shoulder, the small branches that extend out of the stem with small bunches of grapes on them, and it has no dripping, the individual grapes that grow directly on the stem going downwards. If it has either a shoulder or a dripping, it's not olelet that belongs to the owner of the vineyard. It's not considered underdeveloped. But if there's a doubt whether the cluster has these characteristics, it belongs to the poor, because we learned earlier in Perek Daled Mishna Yomi, when you have a safek regarding the gifts of the poor, like leket, if you have a doubt if it belongs to them, we say it's considered full-fledged leket, you must give it to the poor. Now, what does it mean you have a doubt if it's considered a developed cluster or not? So the Rav explains. Let's say, for example, you have a cluster that has small bunches of grapes that look like they're resting on each other, but they're not close together like in a regular case. Therefore, you have a doubt if it looks like it's a shoulder or not. Therefore, we say safek leket leket, safek olelet olelet, and we give it to the poor. Olelet shebal kuba. If you have an olelet on a loaded branch, so you have a branch that contains fully developed clusters and then this underdeveloped cluster. Im nikretzet ima eshkol. If you're able to, if the olelet is close enough to the other clusters that you can cut it from the vine together, the whole branch at once, so the whole branch, including the olelet, belongs to the owner, because we say it's not its own underdeveloped cluster, rather it's a continuation of the other cluster. But if the olelet is far enough from the other clusters, you're not able to cut it together, you have to pick it by itself. Belongs to the poor. Now the Mishnah says, we spoke about a few seconds ago, that a shoulder is you have small bunches of grapes at the top of the cluster, looks like it's resting on one another like a shoulder. Galgel yechidi. If you have, instead of small bunches, you have individual grapes that are on top of the cluster, and these individual grapes rest one on another. So you have the top of a cluster, thick with grapes resting on one another, but instead of bunches of grapes, it's individual grapes resting on one another. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eshkol. Rabbi Yehuda says that's a normal cluster. It's considered a shoulder, therefore it's not olelet, it belongs to the owner. But the sages say it's olelet, has to be left for the poor, because definition of shoulder is small bunches that rest on another, but this cluster that has only individual grapes, that's not called a shoulder, that's not called katef, and therefore it belongs to the poor, it's considered olelet unless it has the other characteristic of the grapes dripping down from the central stem. If it has neither, then it belongs to the poor because this is not considered a shoulder. Mishnah Hey now discusses hamedel bagifanim, someone's thinning out his grapevines, because the way it used to work is that if the vines grew too close together, they would prevent one another from fully growing. So sometimes the owner of the vineyard would uproot some of the vines to let the remaining ones grow better. So if somebody now is thinning out his grapevines to make the other ones grow better, Rabbi Yehuda holds, just like you thin out your own vines to make them grow, the other ones grow better, you can thin out those of the poor, meaning you're uprooting the extra vines, even if they have olelet, which really belongs to the poor. Now, Rabbi Yehuda holds you're allowed to do this because even though the olelet belongs to the poor, the owner treats them just like he treats the property of a partner. The owner is considered a partner with this poor man, and the owner who is treating his vineyard with maintenance doesn't have to ask the partner. So same thing here. I could thin out the branch even though it has olelet without discussing with my partner, with the poor. Now, the Mefarshim explain you cannot just remove olelet. You have to thin out this branch, remove this branch in order to make other branches with olelet grow better. So you're not completely messing up the poor. You're making another branch that has underdeveloped grow better as well. Rabbi Meir says, you're allowed to thin out your own vines, but you're not allowed to thin out the vines of the poor, mainly the ones that have the olelet. You cannot remove those vines because Rabbi Meir holds the poor are not considered your partners. Rather, they're treated like a person who bought part of the field as if they bought it themselves. And if a farmer sells some vines to another person, he's not allowed to thin out those vines without asking the buyer's permission first. Same thing here, you cannot thin out the vines that belong to the poor. And same thing, the Mefarshim explained, they have this machlok about Peah. We know that you have to leave Peah from your vineyard just like by a field. So if a person designated a certain vine or vines as Peah, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir disagree whether you can remove those vines if you need to do so to thin out the vineyard. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.